Educational Communications and this station present Environmental Directions with Nancy Pearlman. On this series, we explore the effects of human influence on the Earth's ecosystems and discuss solutions to environmental problems which affect the quality of life on this planet. Environmental Directions gives you the kind of information you need to help you participate in decisions impacting your community, the nation, and the world. Now, here's your host, Nancy Pearlman.
Hello. For the next half hour, we're going to be talking about forests, logging, wildfires, and the need to preserve our ecosystems with my guest, Dr. Chad Hanson. He is a research ecologist with the Muir Project based in Big Bear City, California. He has published dozens of scientific studies on forests, wildfires, and climate, and is the author of the new book, Smokescreen, Debunking Wildfire Myths to Save Our Forests and Our Climate. Welcome. It's a pleasure to have you with us.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
You have written one of the most superb environmental books of the decade, and you have made a strong case that we need to have wildfires, natural, high-intensity fires, to preserve the snag forests after the fire, and that the regeneration is so critical to the forest ecosystems, and we need to stop logging them. Did I summarize this right?
You did. That's actually a really good summary. I mean, I guess if I wanted to put it into a nutshell, we know we need to do two things to overcome the climate crisis. We need to keep the carbon in the ground and get away from fossil fuels. We also need to keep the carbon in our forests. You
explain how important forests are to help the climate crisis and how the logging actually creates more pollution.
That's absolutely right. People don't realize that logging is one of the largest sources of carbon emissions. Of course, we know we have to get away from fossil fuels to overcome the climate crisis. A lot of people don't realize that the other half of the equation is increasing protection of our forests from logging in order to draw down atmospheric carbon and allow our forests to absorb more of that excess CO2 in the atmosphere, but also to prevent or reduce the carbon emissions from logging itself. In fact, in the U.S., carbon emissions from logging are 10 times higher than they are from wildfires and native bark beetles combined.
But the Forest Service and the logging companies have told us that we need to go in and log areas that have been burned.
Yeah, this is one of the biggest bits of misinformation out there. The number one thing that the United States Forest Service does is sell public timber to private logging companies and keep the revenue. When it comes to live green trees, they keep a portion, sometimes the majority of the revenue, so they have a strong financial incentive to promote logging and also to develop creative justifications to promote logging. When it comes to post-fire logging, logging dead trees, the U.S. Forest Service keeps 100% of the revenue for its budget. It's what we call a perverse financial incentive. These are really archaic laws. They should be outlawed. The Forest Service and other federal land agencies, they should not be in the commercial logging business. We need to have a 21st century conversation about protecting our forests for biodiversity, for recreation jobs, but also for climate change mitigation. When it comes to post-fire logging, this is one of the biggest abuses that we see on our public lands, and the scientific community is overwhelmingly opposed to it.
However, the logging companies and the Forest Service have paid scientists to say that logging is necessary. And you explained that in detail about something called the collaborative, where they try to get everybody together to say, what should we do with this area? And when you objected to some of the proposals, they said you either had to agree and sign off or your opinion was not considered.
That's right. Basically, you have to step in line or they show you the door. The word collaboration sounds good. The way it's being applied in these logging collaboratives is really, really destructive because they're basically pulling together logging industry representatives, U.S. Forest Service staff, and others, and then bringing some environmentalists into the room. But they're always outnumbered, and you have to sign on the dotted line and agree to their logging proposals in order to continue to participate. You generally have to show up in person, certainly before the pandemic, and so it excludes people who are farther away who care about their public lands but are in cities or towns more distant from the forest. People don't realize that this is really just another smokescreen for logging.
There's also the problem of environmental organizations that believe that they need to compromise and sort of choose the lesser of two evils and go along with some of these proposals.
Yeah, that's a big problem. You get this sort of groupthink mentality that happens in these settings, especially when conformity with the Forest Service's logging proposals, when people decide to continue to participate based on what's often a good faith but misguided notion that they can somehow, sort of steer or guide or inform or change the process from the inside. What really happens is that they end up becoming part of the problem.
You have done extensive studies in post-fire areas, and the pictures in your book are amazing because they show where snag forests, the burnt areas, are left, how the plants and the animals come back. In fact, those snag forests are needed for some species. You have pictures showing where those snag forests were logged, and years later, it's dead and the forest hasn't come back. Why do plants and animals need to have this burned area?
That's a great question. It's interesting. And a lot of the things in my field are counterintuitive, which, for me makes it really fascinating. But here's the way it works. So a forest fire burns, and it sends up heat and smoke. And there are dozens of native beetle species called wood-boring beetles. And depending on the species, they've evolved receptors in their bodies over thousands and thousands of years to be able to detect a fire by heat or smoke. And instead of flying away from the fire, these beetles, and they're large and they're good flyers, they'll fly right toward the fire, and they will land on the charred bark of fire-killed trees just after the flames have passed and the trees have cooled. And they lay their eggs, and their larvae develop, and the larvae bore through the bark into the wood of the tree, and they develop there over time into an adult. And then a year or more later, they'll emerge as an adult and fly away and go through another cycle or two in that fire, or fly away and find the next fire. They need these fire-killed trees to reproduce, and they've been doing this for millions of years because this is the way nature is. It's complex. Everybody has a niche. Everyone has a role. There are numerous different native woodpecker species that in turn have evolved to depend on the larvae of the wood-boring beetles for their primary food source. These woodpeckers need fire-killed trees and dead trees in general because they're softer than live trees, and so not only do they have the food from the beetles, but also they excavate nest cavities in the dead trees because, again, they're softer. Woodpeckers, they're mostly monogamous species, and they will excavate 2 to 4 nest cavities in a given year, and the female will pick the one she likes the best each year, and all the ones that they don't use, they're available for all the other cavity nesting species in the forest that have to have cavities in trees to raise their young and reproduce, but they can't create their own. Bluebirds, nuthatches, flying squirrels, chipmunks, dozens and dozens of native bird and small mammal species that need these tree cavities. They have to rely on the woodpeckers to create those, and the woodpeckers, in order to do that, have to have lots of dead trees so they have enough food, and so they have the places to create those cavities. You don't have that food unless you've got the beetles, and you can't have the beetles unless you've got the fire.
Yet you also explain how the woodpecker uses both the non-burned forest and the burned forest, both to live
That's right.
and to
eat.
It's
interesting because what we're finding in the scientific literature is it's not just areas that burn in forest fires that are really good habitat for these woodpeckers. When a forest fire burns, even the biggest ones, they're mostly low and moderate intensity. In other words, most of the trees, especially the mature trees, survive and they remain green. A lot of these areas, you could drive or hike through them, you wouldn't even realize that a fire had passed through. The intensity is so low, and there's so few trees that are killed. But there are patches, oftentimes 20, 25, sometimes 30% of a given fire that burns hotter, and they'll create those high-intensity fire patches that create snag forest habitat. Well, it turns out snag forest habitat can also be created in places where drought and native bark beetles, a different group of native beetle species, kill most or all the trees in given patches. And it's surprisingly uncommon. Usually, when you get a drought, you'll get a small percentage of the trees being killed. But in certain places, you'll get a patch here, a patch there, several acres, sometimes some dozens of acres, where the majority of the trees are killed. And it turns out that is just like burned snag forest habitat. It's incredibly biodiverse. There are a lot of woodpecker species that are associated with it and depend on it, a lot of secondary cavity nesters, a lot of fly-catching birds and bats because of all the wildflowers and flowering shrubs that grow in the understory after the overstory trees die, and a lot of small mammals and amphibians and reptiles that depend on the shrubs that grow in and the down logs. It's just really rich, important habitat. In fact, snag forest habitat, whether it's from fire or drought, is actually comparable to old-growth forest in terms of native biodiversity and wildlife abundance. It is actually an ecological treasure.
In essence, you're advocating let the natural wildfires burn, but you also advocate for the communities to have 100 feet clearance from their dwellings so that the homes and stores and buildings don't burn.
That's right, and the two things are really connected in a very important way. In our forests, we actually have significantly less fire now than we had historically, naturally, before fire suppression. We actually have a deficit of fire in our forests, and there's wide agreement on that among scientists in my field. Certain ecosystem types, like Southern California chaparral, have too much fire because generally close to population centers, and there's a lot of accidental and unplanned human ignitions. But in forests, we have a deficit of fire, so we don't want to exacerbate that deficit. We want to allow more lightning strikes to burn further away from homes in remote forests. And we need to focus our resources and attention not on backcountry logging and backcountry fire suppression, but instead on helping communities become fire safe, helping homeowners fireproof their homes, and developing evacuation plans and early warning systems for communities when there's a fire nearby, and evacuation assistance, all the things that save homes and lives.
How many different study areas do you use and have you reported on?
Oh, dozens over the years. I've been studying forest fires, in particular large fires, and especially large high-intensity fire patches in forests for 20 years in the field, publishing as a scientist on this topic for 16 years.
Is there one area that has done better that would be an example of what other forest areas could do?
Well, that's the interesting thing, is that they all do great. This is what's so cool about this, is that the natural regeneration of the forest that happens after fire, and including after high-intensity fire, is not exceptional in some fires. It's not unique to one fire or another. It's something that's widespread, it's common, it's pervasive, as long as we allow the forest to go through natural succession, as they've been doing for millions and millions of years, instead of going in with post-fire logging and artificial planting of trees, which in many cases ends up essentially deforesting the landscape. And you'll see this in these areas. You'll see areas that are largely bare ground, some surviving planted trees, but mostly dead, and just all the stumps where they did the logging, right next to an area that they didn't log or plant, where the natural forest regeneration is 12 feet tall several years after the fire, or 6 feet tall, depending upon the growing conditions. And you've got the standing snags and the shrubs and the wildflowers and all the life and richness, and of course all the carbon still in the forest. Whereas in the logged area, most of that carbon is in the atmosphere, making climate change worse. The really interesting thing is, I've been doing research in these areas for basically 2 decades now. I can't find a single acre that doesn't regenerate in one form or another naturally after fire. Sometimes it's more oak, sometimes it's more pine, sometimes it's more fir cedar, but they always regenerate if they're left to nature.
Decades ago in the 80s, I went in and saw the logging and the replanting supposedly by the Forest Service and the logging companies, and those areas are dead. They're plantations of one species of tree, and they don't survive. They don't have the diversity that is necessary for wildlife. It's just a greenwashing effect, public relations effort.
That's right. In fact, in most cases, what's happening, in fact, is not only are they destroying important wildlife habitat and sending most of that carbon into the atmosphere, because that's what happens with logging. Most of the carbon in a tree that's logged doesn't end up in a 2x4 in a building somewhere. Most of it ends up in the atmosphere very quickly, very rapidly, as I talk about in my book, Smokescreen. But in addition, when they do these post-fire logging operations, they literally roll over and kill most of the natural forest regeneration that's already growing in after the fire for free, because the logging equipment is ground-based. It's tractors and it's bulldozers and it's other ground-based machinery, and they literally roll over and kill the natural regeneration. So when they plant these seedlings, these nursery-grown seedlings that they grow many, many miles away, they're planting them in an area that's already been damaged by the logging equipment, where the soil's been compacted and the nutrients have been removed. And they're not planting the fine-scale genetic diversity that's adapted to that particular location and soil conditions and slope and aspect that goes back thousands of years. Instead, they're planting these nursery-grown trees that are not adapted to that local microsite, and they oftentimes die.
We're going to talk more about the need to have forests preserved and protected from logging, to allow wildfires to preserve and protect the habitat, with my guest, Dr. Chad Hanson, author of Smokescreen, when we return in a moment.
Environmental Directions with Nancy Pearlman continues with further discussion of the world's critical ecological issues. For more information, you may call 310-559-9160 or go to www.ecoprojects.org. Now, here's Nancy.
I'm speaking with Dr. Chad Hanson, research ecologist with the John Muir Project and author of Smokescreen, Debunking Wildfire Myths to Save Our Forests and Our Climate. Your book is a superb documentation of what has been going on, what needs to go on, but I also enjoyed your personal stories. Like so many others, you and I are environmentalists, and we bought into the myth that there needs to be fire suppression. And you were hiking in the forest. Tell me the story of how you discovered that maybe that's not the case.
Yeah, I got into this issue in 1989. My older brother and I hiked the Pacific Crest Trail from Mexico to Canada, and I had taken a year off of college to do this. As we got into the northern Sierra Nevada, my older brother and I, we began to see these signs on Forest Service lands that said, trail washed out, take detour. And every time we would take the detour, and it would take us sometimes miles out of our way, sometimes away from water sources, and it became a real problem, an inconvenience. You really figured out how many miles you can do in a given time period in a given day, and all of a sudden, 3 or 4 miles get added. But we dutifully followed the signs, and then one day in the northern Sierra Nevada, we saw 2 men writing something on the sign. So as we approached, they saw us, and they hiked ahead of us further down the trail, and we came up to the sign, and it was the usual Forest Service sign that said, trail washed out, take detour. But written on the sign in pen, it said, clear cuts ahead, it's a scam. So we ignored the sign this time. We did not take the detour. We stayed on the Pacific Crest Trail, and within about 100 yards or so, we walked into this giant clear cut on our public lands. We were just shocked. There were stumps all the way up to the ridge top. Ultimately, we hiked fast up the trail to see if we can catch up with these guys, and we did. Turns out they were the guys putting up the signs. They worked for the Forest Service, but they knew the signs were being put up to hide the clear-cut logging operations from the hikers and other recreationalists. And so we ended up hiking with these guys for a while, and they told us about how the logging program happens on national forests. And I was not aware of this. I didn't even know that there was a logging program on national forests. I had no idea that the Forest Service was selling public timber to private logging companies and keeping the revenue, that they were essentially acting like a giant logging corporation. When we reached Canada in September of 1989 and came home, I got involved. I've been involved in forest protection ever since.
You had another Forest Service employee run out and secretly tell you that there are quotas of how much logging needs to go on when the public relations people with the Forest Service said there weren't.
Yeah, the Forest Service, we kept saying, listen, it seems like you're trying to meet some sort of a timber volume quota every year with your logging projects. And this was one of these logging collaboratives, and the Forest Service kept denying it. And it turns out that they knew very well that they did have a quota, and one of their staffers, to his great credit, revealed that. When the Forest Service is being told, hey, listen, you need to get the cutout, and the public is being told, oh no, we're doing these projects for forest health or fuel reduction or restoration. It's one of the things I talk about a lot in my Smokescreen book is the deceptive euphemisms that are being used to hide and disguise the commercial logging that's been going on for decades. But now they don't call it logging or timber sales. They call it forest health. They call it fuel reduction. They call it restoration. They call it just about anything to hide the fact that it's actually just logging.
Indeed, you describe the need for a new wildlife vocabulary, wildfire vocabulary. You even talk about the need to change the colors on the maps to show that red isn't so dangerous. Maybe the areas that have burned high intensity should be green because that's so necessary.
Yeah, and in fact, not only are those high intensity areas necessary, but if they are not logged and they're allowed to regenerate naturally, it actually ends up being the greenest part of the landscape because of all the natural regeneration of conifers and oaks and shrubs. It is so lush and so green. I mean, I took this one reporter into one of the largest high intensity fire patches in the Rim Fire, an area that we had kept the Forest Service from logging and destroying. And this was at 5 or 6 years post-fire, and we were hiking through, and he said, this is the barren wasteland that the Forest Service keeps talking about. He said, it's like a rainforest in here. And that was just him talking about his own perception as we weaved our way and pushed aside and walked through 8, 10, 12-foot tall black oaks and incense cedar and ponderosa pine saplings and the native shrubs and all the wildflowers. So it's just not at all what people think of. This kind of shocking red that they use to show high-intensity fire, when they do these maps after fires, is really very pejorative. It's really biased because, of course, we associate that kind of bright red with stop, with caution, with danger, with something that's bad. And in fact, it really draws the eye. I do this experiment when I give presentations. I show this image of the rimfire and the map where the high intensity is in red and the moderate intensity is in yellow and the low intensity is in green. I ask people to tell me what percentage of the fire they think the red comprises. And people say, well, maybe 40 or 50%, maybe 60%. It's actually 19.9%. And yet it looks like it's the majority to a lot of people because red is so shocking to the eye and it draws the eye.
You're based in Big Bear City in the San Bernardino National Forest in Southern California. You've done your research extensively in the Sierra Nevada mountains as well. And yet this issue doesn't apply just to California's mountains, but the East Coast as well?
That's right. People think of fire as a Western issue, and of course it is a Western issue, but it's not exclusively a Western issue. Fire is natural in the forests of the Western United States. It's natural in the boreal forests of Canada. It's natural in the Southern Appalachians, in the Southeast. It's natural in the Northeastern forests as well. Subtle and sometimes not so subtle differences in fire regimes, but typically mixed intensity fires of one form or another, and they're natural. In fact, it's natural in forests all over the world. We have a long and deep evolutionary history with fire in our forests that goes back 350 million years.
And yet the whole idea now is to change our policies to allow nature to take its course.
That's certainly what I recommend. We need to trust nature. We need to trust the natural world. We need to trust evolution and science. In fact, for many forests around the world and in this country, fire is as essential to forest ecosystems and biodiversity as sun and rain.
Not only have you expressed your opinion and summarized some of your research, you have documented detailed notes of other studies, of other scientists and authors to provide the information that you have. I have read hundreds of environmental books doing this radio show, and I would certainly put Smokescreen, Debunking Wildlife Myths to Save Our Forests and Our Climate in the top 10. I wish that every politician, every environmentalist would read this. It changed my opinion because you've documented the fact that forests and fires are needed, and we have to stop the logging.
Well, thank you. That means a lot to me. That means a great deal, and I appreciate the compliment. Not only do we need to protect our forests from logging, to protect biodiversity, to protect communities, because the logging often makes the fires burn hotter and faster toward towns, contrary to what the Forest Service and the logging industry are saying. They try to spin logging as fuel reduction. In reality, it's making the fires burn hotter to areas that are really degraded after the logging. It's not creating good snag forest habitat. It's actually degrading the landscape. But the other thing that's so important is that we have to protect our forests to overcome the climate crisis. We can't succeed without it, because once we put the CO2 into the atmosphere, all that excess CO2 from human activities, fossil fuel burning and logging, it stays there for a very, very long time, many decades, even centuries. And so we have to not make it worse. Certainly, we have to move away from fossil fuel consumption and reduce and curb our logging activities and protect our forests to reduce our emissions. But we also have to draw down the existing CO2 levels. And the best and most effective and most environmentally beneficial way to do that is to protect natural ecosystems, especially forests, but also wetlands and grasslands, desert habitats, chaparral, woodlands, natural habitats all over the world that pull CO2 out of the atmosphere. We need to keep the carbon in those ecosystems and allow them to do their natural work, because unless we do that, we can't overcome the climate crisis. But if we do that, in addition to curbing and getting away from fossil fuels, we will overcome the crisis.
You and I both love nature. I'd like to quote how much you appreciate the natural world when you said that you provide your deepest gratitude to all the wild places and wild things, their beauty, complexity, elegance, and majesty, that they have been lifelong inspirations to you, and they've been lifelong inspirations to me as well. The little creatures, the big creatures, the big trees, the little plants. Is there any special animal or plant that has really moved you the most?
That's a great question. For me, there isn't just one, and it's certainly not necessarily the largest or most charismatic of creatures. I appreciate them too and love them also. But sometimes for me, it's these subtle little animals that many people don't even know exist that I find most interesting. Some of the wood warblers that really just go unnoticed by people, but are such a key component of the native shrubs that grow in the understory after high-intensity fire, like orange-crowned warblers and yellow warblers, for example. Rare species that most people don't even think about or know exist, like the Pacific fisher, which most people think is a bird or something, and it's actually a carnivore, like a small wolverine, which depends on mature and old forests for denning and resting, but it uses the snag forest habitat very, very actively for foraging and hunting. It depends on all the small mammals that it finds as its prey in the snag forest. It's so rare and so elusive. It might as well be Bigfoot as far as most people are concerned, because this almost mythical creature that is able to move through the forest more rapidly than a person can run over logs and through shrubs, and is rarely ever seen.
Your research has definitely debunked some myths, and one of those is that to protect our communities, we need to log the forests, and yet you point out that the fires spread faster from the logged areas than they do from the non-logged areas, that the fires go more slowly and are less dangerous if we allow the natural ecosystems to stay.
Yeah, that's right. Logging is putting communities at risk on 3 different levels. Number one, it's making fires burn faster and hotter toward the towns in most cases compared to denser unlogged forests. But the other one is it's diverting scarce resources away from community protection into these backcountry logging projects, because of course resources are finite. And the third one is that it's giving communities this false sense of security that somehow this logging project out there in the wildlands, miles away over that ridge, is somehow going to save them from fire. And so people, they think, well, why do I need to spend the money to do my defensible space pruning this fire season? Why do I need to take the effort to sweep those dry pine needles off my roof? Why do I need to put on a rain gutter guard, spend a few $100s to put on ember-proof vents on my house? Simple, highly effective things that are known to save the vast majority of homes from wildfire if they're done. But people think, well, I'm being told by the Forest Service, an agency that I trust, I'm being told by the logging industry and by politicians that the solution, the answer is to do more logging out in the forest. As long as they call it fuel reduction, well, maybe that'll stop the fire, and so maybe I shouldn't spend that money. And that is putting people at risk. It is actually costing lives. It's costing entire communities every fire season. And the fact is, it's almost entirely preventable. If we shift gears, if we change direction and protect our forests from logging and shift our resources and our attention into helping communities become fire safe, especially lower income communities where people really do need the resources and the financial help and the technical assistance to make that happen, we can save the vast majority of homes. We have example after example where over 99% of homes are surviving even intense wildland fires if these measures are taken and if that assistance is provided.
You provide important scientific data in such an easy-to-read way that non-scientists can really grasp the problem, the issue, and have the information to back up your position.
Yeah, absolutely. That was intentional. I have hundreds and hundreds of scientific studies cited in the book in the endnotes. But the fact is, I wrote the book, and the way I wrote it, and the way I described the issues, I very purposely wrote it for non-scientists because we really need to engage the public on these issues and really mobilize the public to put pressure on policymakers to stop funding and subsidizing logging on both public and private lands and redirect those subsidies into green jobs that will actually protect homes and lives in communities and create more recreation jobs out in our forests.
Why is logging worse for forest fires?
What logging does is basically it removes most of the trees in a given stand of forest. People think, well, maybe that's removing trees is removing or reducing fuel. The reality is that logging changes the microclimate of the forest. It reduces the cooling shade of the forest canopy, and it creates hotter, drier, and windier conditions in the forest, and allows the winds that drive forest fires to sweep through the forest more rapidly and more intensely. In addition, logging leaves behind combustible and kindling-like slash debris, branches and treetops that are left behind by logging companies, and it spreads highly combustible invasive grasses like cheatgrass. Logging actually creates a microclimate that's more conducive to fire and more intense fire.
Thank you so very much for presenting presenting this information and informing us that we have to look at fires, forests, and logging in a different way than we have been. Thank you so very much for being my guest.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
I have been speaking with Dr. Chad Hanson, research ecologist with the John Muir Project, and author of Smokescreen, Debunking Wildfire Myths to Save Our Forests and Our Climate. I'm Nancy Perlman. Thank you very much for joining us, and do tune in again next week.
If you would like free information about these environmental issues, go to www.ecoprojects.org or call 310-559-9160. Environmental Directions with your host, Nancy Perlman, is a community affairs program of the nonprofit organization Educational Communications and this station.